Hey guys, tonight we begin with the utterly unfortunate fate of being an Aztec sacrifice victim. A role nobody auditioned for, but somehow thousands got cast in anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the Aztec Empire, you didn't sign up to be a sacrifice victim. There wasn't a volunteer box on any form, no pamphlet explaining the benefits, and definitely no severance package. This was a role you inherited through bad luck, bad timing, or bad geography. The easiest way to get picked was to be a captured warrior. Now, you might think that meant you fought badly, but in Aztec warfare, it was actually the opposite. If you fought bravely and skillfully, the enemy would rather keep you alive. Not because they liked you, but because you'd make an impressive gift to the gods. Essentially, you were a living trophy, just one that didn't get to sit on a shelf. Slaves could also be chosen, sometimes after being treated suspiciously well. You'd be given rich clothes, a diet far better than you'd ever had before, and maybe even paraded around as the living embodiment of a god. Sounds nice. Until you remember, the final act involves an obsidian blade and a lot of chanting. It was the ancient equivalent of being wined and dined before being politely escorted out of existence. And then there were the unlucky civilians. Strong, healthy, in the prime of life. Congratulations. You had the perfect resume for being ceremonially removed from the population. A job offer you couldn't refuse. From the outside, the role looked glamorous. You'd get fine garments, ceremonial jewelry, and an audience wherever you went. People might even look at you with admiration. Though, let's be honest, part of that was relief that they weren't the one in your sandals. To the Aztecs, you were chosen for the highest honor, helping keep the sun moving across the sky. To you, it was more like winning the worst lottery in history. A jackpot that came with free meals, new clothes, and a guaranteed one-way trip to the top of the Great Temple. It was all part religious devotion, part public spectacle. Your final moments weren't just for the gods. They were for the crowd, the priests, and anyone in a neighboring city thinking about challenging Aztec power. In short, you were about to be famous for about 2 minutes. Once you were chosen for sacrifice, the Aztecs made sure you knew it wasn't random. It was destiny. The gods, they said, had smiled upon you, which is a poetic way of saying you'd been hand-picked for an appointment you could never cancel. The Aztec worldview was built on reciprocity with the gods. The sun rose, the rains fell, and the corn grew because humans gave back, not in coins or flowers, but in blood. Your blood. To them, this was the highest compliment. You were worthy of feeding the divine. To you, it was like being told you'd been selected as Employee of the Month, only to find out the reward was being ceremonially fired from life. Priests would remind you daily how special you were. They'd talk about how your spirit would ascend to the highest heavens, how the gods themselves would welcome you, and how your sacrifice would ensure the world didn't collapse into eternal darkness. It was touching, really. Except for the part where none of this changed the fact that you were on a countdown clock. Some chosen victims leaned into it. If you were already doomed, you might as well enjoy the perks, the richer food, the ceremonial drinks, the fact that you could say whatever you wanted without worrying about tomorrow, because, well, there wasn't going to be one. Others, however, had a harder time buying into the honor part. Being told you're special loses some sparkle when it comes from the same guy sharpening the obsidian blade. Your family might be proud, or at least pretend to be, because publicly questioning the ritual wasn't exactly safe. Neighbors would nod with solemn respect as you walked by, wearing fine clothes and painted in sacred patterns. But deep down, they were thinking, better him than me. To the outside world, you were now untouchable, revered, almost holy. In reality, you were the centerpiece in a grand performance that everyone was looking forward to, except you. The priests called it a sacred duty. You might have called it a one-way promotion to the afterlife. Being special in the Aztec Empire had its perks, but as you'd soon find out, it also had a very sharp, very ceremonial downside. One of the strangest things about being chosen for sacrifice in the Aztec Empire was how well you were treated before the big day. It was almost suspicious. You went from ordinary life, whether as a captured warrior, a slave, or a citizen, to what could only be described as the ancient equivalent of an all-inclusive resort. Suddenly, you were fed rich, flavorful meals. None of the bland maize porridge you might have been used to. We're talking tamales, fresh fruit, maybe even cacao drinks. Food normally reserved for nobility. Your clothes upgraded too. No more worn tunics. Now you wore fine cotton garments, dyed in bright colors and decorated with intricate patterns. You might even get jewelry. It was all very flattering, right up until you remembered why they were doing it. The reason was simple. Appearances mattered. You weren't just any sacrifice. You were a gift to the gods, and a shabby offering would be insulting. Think of it like wrapping a present in gold foil before handing it over, except in this case, you were the present. Some victims enjoyed the experience while it lasted. After all, it's hard not to appreciate good food, comfortable clothing, and the sudden interest everyone takes in you. You might even be given ceremonial tasks, singing, dancing, or appearing in processions as part of the festival build-up. Of course, the VIP part had limits. You couldn't exactly leave, and your schedule was not your own. Priests checked on you regularly, not because they were concerned for your well-being, but because losing you before the ceremony would ruin the program. You were essentially a walking, talking centerpiece that had to be kept in perfect condition until showtime. The public, meanwhile, would see you pass and whisper about how honored you must feel. They'd point out your fine clothes, your confident walk, and the fact that you were treated like nobility. Few mentioned the obvious, that all of this was temporary, very temporary. The Aztecs believed the gods deserved the best, so for a little while, you were the best. You ate like a noble, dressed like a noble, and were paraded like a noble. The only difference was that actual nobles got to keep enjoying those things after the festival. You, on the other hand, were on borrowed luxury, and the due date was approaching fast. As the festival approached, your VIP makeover wasn't complete without one final touch, the ceremonial body paint. The Aztecs took this seriously. You weren't just getting a few stripes and swirls. This was a full-on transformation into a walking piece of religious art. The priests would carefully paint your face and body with symbolic designs. Each color and pattern meant something. Red for the rising sun, black for the underworld, white for death, and so on. Sometimes, they'd paint you to resemble a specific god you were meant to stand in for during the ceremony. This wasn't a casual face paint job from a village fair. This was sacred, deliberate, and done with pigments so vivid they'd probably still be visible after your final scene. To the crowd, these patterns weren't just decoration. They were a clear announcement. Here is the honored sacrifice. In other words, the ancient equivalent of walking around with a giant neon sign saying main event. You couldn't blend in even if you wanted to. The process itself was surprisingly meticulous. You'd be seated or stood in a special area while the priests mixed the pigments from minerals, plants, and even insects. Yes, Some of the most brilliant colours came from crushed bugs. It was all very creative, if a bit unsettling to realise your glowing red arm was courtesy of beetle powder. Once painted, you became part of the festival's visual spectacle. Children would point, elders would nod approvingly. Strangers might offer you flowers or food, partly out of respect and partly out of the belief that it was good luck to give a gift to someone destined for the gods. Of course, there was a double edge to all of this. The paint was meant to elevate you spiritually, but it also removed any last trace of anonymity. Not that you had much before, but now there was no mistaking you for an innocent bystander. You were a marked person in every sense. Still, there was something strangely empowering about it. You'd been chosen, dressed, fed, and now turned into a living symbol. It was pageantry at its finest, just with a slightly fatal ending. The Aztecs believed the gods would recognize you instantly when the time came. Unfortunately, so would everyone else. If you thought the morning of your sacrifice might at least start off peacefully, you'd be wrong. There was no gentle sunrise and birdsong to ease you into your last day. Instead, you woke up to the deep, pounding beat of ceremonial drums echoing across the city. And these weren't background drums. They were the kind of drums that made your chest vibrate and reminded you that, yes, you had an appointment on the great temple steps in just a few hours. The drums weren't there for your benefit. They were for everyone else. A signal to the city that the festival had begun, that the gods were about to be honored, and that all eyes should be on the ceremonial proceedings. Of course, they also worked as an excellent alarm clock for the guest of honor. No hitting snooze here. Priests would arrive early to check on you. They'd offer food, perhaps some ritual drinks, and a final round of ceremonial blessings. It might almost feel comforting if it weren't for the subtle tension in the air. These weren't casual morning greetings. These were the last-minute rituals to prepare you for your starring role. By now, you were fully dressed in your ceremonial garments, adorned with feathers, jewelry, and freshly touched-up paint. The air smelled of incense, flowers, and anticipation. Somewhere nearby, other participants were also getting ready. Dancers, musicians, and fellow victims, each with their own assigned moment in the ceremony. As the drums grew louder, the atmosphere shifted from morning calm to public spectacle. The city came alive. People gathered in the plazas, climbing onto rooftops for a better view. Merchants sold festival foods. Children darted between the crowds, trying to catch glimpses of the preparations. The excitement was palpable, though you, of course, were experiencing a different kind of thrill. And here's the thing. The Aztecs genuinely believed this was a good day for you. They thought you were stepping into eternal honor, joining the gods in the afterlife. So when the priests looked at you and smiled, it wasn't sarcasm. They meant it. The reality? Your morning was less preparing for glory and more final boarding call. The drums didn't just mark the start of the festival. They were the countdown clock you couldn't ignore. After the drums had done their job of reminding you that this was, in fact, your final day, it was time for the next act, the ceremonial procession. This was not a subtle, slip in through the side entrance type of affair. No, you were front and center in a parade designed to make sure the entire city knew exactly who the main event was. Priests led the way, their robes flowing, incense burners swinging in slow arcs, filling the air with fragrant smoke. Behind them came dancers in feathered costumes, musicians with flutes and rattles, and attendants carrying banners. And then there was you, painted, dressed, and walking in the middle of the grand parade like an honored dignitary, whose tenure was about to end abruptly. People lined the streets to watch. Some shouted blessings, some offered flowers, and a few probably made wagers about how composed you'd look on the altar. Children pointed with wide-eyed fascination. Elders nodded gravely. Merchants closed their stalls just to see you pass. It was a spectacle, and you were the star, even if you'd have preferred a less dramatic role. The procession wound its way through the main plaza, ensuring that as many people as possible got a good look at you. In a way, it was the Aztec version of a farewell tour, except instead of signing autographs, you were receiving ceremonial offerings. Every step was accompanied by music, pounding drums, piercing flutes, and the occasional cheer from the crowd. The noise was constant, impossible to ignore. It was meant to energize the festival, but it also made it impossible to pretend this was just another religious service. As you approached the base of the great temple, the crowd grew denser, and the anticipation thicker. You could see the steep steps ahead, rising toward the altar. The music swelled. The smell of incense was almost overwhelming now. This was the moment the parade transitioned into something else, the climb. The strange thing was, everyone watching truly believed this was an honor. They weren't mocking you, they were celebrating you. Unfortunately, their definition of celebrating involved you not making it back down those steps in one piece. The parade was grand, colourful, and unforgettable. For everyone else, it was a highlight of the year. For you, it was just the most elaborate walk to work you'd ever take, and the last. Standing at the base of the great temple, you finally got a proper look at the stairs. They didn't just lead up, they soared upward like the world's steepest treadmill, minus the handrails, and plus several hundred spectators watching your every move. If you weren't feeling nervous before, the sheer verticality of it all was enough to make you reconsider your life choices. Not that you had any left to make. These weren't short steps either. The great temple could be over 100 feet tall, and each step was deliberately steep. The climb was symbolic, rising from the mortal world toward the gods, but in practice, it mostly symbolized how much your legs were going to burn. You'd be barefoot or in thin sandals, so every stone was another reminder that you were very much alive. For now, priests escorted you, sometimes holding your arms to assist you. Whether they were helping you reach the top or making sure you didn't bolt halfway up is a matter of interpretation. The crowd's chanting and the rhythmic drum beats echoed up the temple's walls, making the climb feel even more surreal. Halfway up, you might glance back. The city stretched out below, bustling marketplaces, shimmering canals, distant mountains, a living postcard of the world you were about to leave. And if you turned forward, there was the altar, framed by the twin temples of Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, gleaming in the sunlight. Both gods were eager for your arrival, apparently. Some victims tried to climb slowly, hoping to delay the inevitable. Others climbed quickly, either to get it over with, or because the priests behind them were nudging a little too enthusiastically. There was no good pace. Every step was just another closer to the end. By the time you reached the top, the air felt thinner, the drums louder, and the reality heavier. The climb wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Each step stripped away any illusion that this was all ceremonial pageantry. Now, standing on the temple platform with the altar before you, the drums reached a fever pitch. You'd made it to the top, which, in this situation, was unfortunately not the kind of achievement anyone envied. Reaching the top of the great temple should have felt like a victory. After all, not everyone got to stand up here. But when the only way down involved not being alive anymore, the sense of achievement was mixed. From up here, the view was breathtaking. You could see the sprawling city of Tenochtitlan in all its glory, canals glinting in the sun, bustling markets, shimmering lakes stretching into the horizon. It was the kind of view real estate agents would kill for, or in this case, sacrifice for. For a fleeting moment, You might even forget why you were here. Then, the altar came into your peripheral vision, and the illusion crumbled. The priests were already in position, their ornate headdresses swaying in the breeze, obsidian blades gleaming just enough to catch the light and your attention. Their faces were calm, almost businesslike. This wasn't personal. To them, you were one part of a sacred schedule, slotted neatly between morning dances and the afternoon feast. The crowd below looked smaller now, but the sound carried. Drums thundered, shells rattled, voices chanted in unison. It was like standing on stage in front of thousands of people, except instead of delivering a speech, you were about to deliver your heart. Literally. Up here, the air smelled of incense and flowers, masking, for the moment, what was about to happen. Colourful banners flapped against the temple's edges, and offerings of maize, cacao, and feathers lay in neat piles. It was beautiful in the way only something both sacred and terrifying can be. Some victims reportedly felt a strange calm at this point. The climb was over, the crowd was here, the gods were watching. There was nothing left to do but go through with it. Others found their senses sharpening, noticing every tiny detail. The texture of the stone beneath their feet, the glint of the ceremonial jewelry, the heat of the sun pressing on their back. From this vantage point, you were at the pinnacle of Aztec life, literally and figuratively. Unfortunately, the only way forward from the pinnacle was straight into legend, and the afterlife. The view from the top was magnificent, yes, but it was also the kind of view you could only enjoy once. The moment had finally arrived. The chanting below swelled into a steady, hypnotic rhythm, as if the entire city were holding its breath. Up here, on the temple platform, the priests moved with deliberate precision. No one rushed. No one fumbled. This was a performance they had rehearsed countless times, though never with you in the starring role. First came the ceremonial blessings. The head priest circled you, sprinkling sacred water, waving incense smoke in your direction, and chanting prayers to the gods. If you didn't know better, you might think they were preparing you for a wedding. The difference was that in this ceremony, the vows were entirely one-sided. The crowd below could see you clearly now. From this height, their faces were tiny, but their unified chanting was unmistakable. Every beat of the drum seemed to echo in your chest, keeping pace with your heartbeat, which, ironically, was about to become the centerpiece of the event. Then came the positioning. 4 attendants stepped forward, each taking an arm or a leg. Not roughly, but firmly, as though you were being tucked into bed. A very permanent bed. The priests didn't waste time explaining what would happen next. In the Aztec world, everyone already knew the steps, quite literally, by heart. The obsidian blade was brought forward. It was a beautiful tool, razor-sharp, black as midnight, and capable of slicing through flesh like a hot knife through soft maize bread. This wasn't some dull prop. It was the real deal, meticulously crafted for the gods' satisfaction. From the corner of your eye, you might notice other offerings laid out nearby. Maize, cacao beans, colourful feathers, perhaps even small figurines. These were the supporting cast to your main act, the extra tokens of devotion to accompany your contribution. The air grew heavy. The incense smoke thickened, the chanting intensified, and the priest's hands became steady as stone. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. The Aztecs prided themselves on the precision of their rituals. At this point, you realized there was no more next. The ritual wasn't about to start. It was starting. And as far as the Aztecs were concerned, the gods were leaning in, eager for the show, If there was ever a point in the ceremony where all pretense fell away, this was it. The blessings were over. The crowd's chanting was at full volume, and you were lying on your back, staring up at the open sky. Somewhere above, the gods you were supposedly helping must have been leaning over the clouds like curious spectators. The 4 attendants kept you firmly in place. Again, they weren't cruel about it, more like craftsmen holding a precious object steady. It just so happened the object was your ribcage. The high priest, blade in hand, stepped into your line of sight. Obsidian doesn't gleam like metal. It catches the light in sharp, glassy flashes. Beautiful, in an unnerving way. The priest raised it to the sun for a brief moment, offering it symbolically to the heavens. Then, without hesitation, he began. The Aztecs prided themselves on speed. This wasn't meant to be a prolonged ordeal. A skilled priest could make the cut and remove the heart in mere seconds. The obsidian edge sliced cleanly. It was sharp enough to make modern surgeons nod in approval, though the operating room etiquette was slightly different here. From the crowd's perspective, this was the climax, the sacred exchange between human and divine. From your perspective, it was, well, probably best not to dwell on that. The heart, still beating, was lifted high toward the sky, the priest chanting words of offering. The symbolism was clear. Your life force was now quite literally in the hands of the gods. The crowd erupted in renewed chants and drumbeats. Down below, people believed they were witnessing the moment the sun's journey across the sky had been assured for another day, that the rains would come and the crops would grow. Meanwhile, the rest of you was respectfully placed aside, ready for the next phase of the ritual. In the Aztec worldview, nothing here was wasteful. Your body had spiritual, ceremonial, and sometimes even practical uses afterward. It was over quickly. The anticipation had been far longer than the act itself. For the Aztecs, this was the pinnacle of devotion. For you, let's just say it was a very one-sided arrangement. You might think that once your heart was lifted skyward, your part in the ceremony was done. In a way, yes, you'd finished your active role. But in the Aztec world, even the after had its own ritual choreography. First, the heart was placed in a sacred vessel or on a stone altar dedicated to the god in question, usually Huitzilopochtli or Tlaloc. This was the divine handoff, the moment when your essence officially switched teams from mortal to eternal. The priests treated this part with deep reverence, because if the gods weren't satisfied, well, the harvest could fail, the rains might not come, and everyone would be cranky. Your body, meanwhile, didn't just get tossed aside. It was carefully handled, sometimes rolled down the temple steps as part of the dramatic symbolism. Watching this from below was a reminder to the crowd. This was the price of keeping the world running. Plus, let's be honest, in terms of stagecraft, nothing made a bigger impression than a body making its way down 100 feet of stone stairs. Once at the bottom, your remains could serve multiple purposes. Sometimes they were given to important warriors or nobles, not as a trophy, but as a sacred connection to the gods. In rare cases, your bones might be cleaned and preserved as relics, a permanent testament to your service. In certain festivals, parts of the sacrificed might even be used in ritual meals, not because the Aztecs were looking for extra protein, but because they believed consuming a piece of someone who had been so honored allowed the eater to share in their divine essence. To them, this was spiritual recycling at its finest. The ceremony didn't end abruptly. It flowed right into dances, songs, and feasting. The city was alive with celebration, not mourning. For the crowd, you had just completed the ultimate act of devotion, ensuring life and balance for everyone. For you, it was, well, you weren't in much of a position to complain anymore. In the Aztec mindset, you hadn't been lost. You'd been transformed. though from your perspective, the transformation was a little too final for comfort. Once your part in the ceremony wrapped up, and by wrapped up, I mean completed in the most permanent way possible, the festival didn't pause for mourning or reflection. In fact, it did quite the opposite. The drums kept beating, the flutes kept wailing, and the dancers picked up where they left off, as if nothing particularly dramatic had just happened on top of the great temple. The city square became a whirlwind of movement. Vendors reopened their stalls, hawking tamales, tortillas, cacao drinks, and roasted maize. Children darted between legs, chasing each other with sticks and feathers. Couples leaned against walls, enjoying the music and keeping half an eye on the next phase of the ceremonies. This wasn't disrespect. It was the Aztec way of honoring the gods. Life went on, because that was the whole point of the sacrifice, to keep the sun moving, the rain falling, and the crops growing. Stopping to grieve would have been seen as missing the bigger picture. Musicians roamed through the crowd, rattling shells and striking drums in intricate rhythms. Dancers, still in elaborate feathered headdresses, spun and stamped in time with the music. Their movements were symbolic, reenacting myths, battles, and celestial stories. Somewhere in the choreography, the act you'd just been part of was being retold in a stylized form. It's possible your role was already being interpreted by someone else in the square. Feasting began in earnest. Communal meals were a vital part of any major religious festival. Nobles ate rich stews and delicacies, while commoners enjoyed simpler but plentiful fare. Cups of fermented maguey drink were passed around. Toasts were made, to the gods, to the warriors, and yes, to the sacrifices that made the day possible. From a bystander's perspective, it was joyful, even uplifting. From your perspective, well, you weren't exactly at the table anymore. But in the Aztec worldview, your spirit was present, watching, and possibly enjoying the festivities from a front row seat in the afterlife. The festival would last well into the night. More ceremonies, more dances, more songs, and somewhere in the rhythm of it all, the people of Tenochtitlan felt secure, certain that their world was still in balance. For everyone else, the festival was a high point of the year. For you, it was, quite literally, your grand finale. In the Aztec worldview, becoming a sacrifice didn't make you a tragic figure. It made you a celebrity. Granted, it was the sort of fame you couldn't exactly enjoy in person, but your name, if people actually remembered it, was now tied to the sacred duty of keeping the cosmos in order. Among your family, you'd likely be spoken of with pride. Yes, my cousin helped make sure the sun rose last week. No big deal, they might say at future gatherings, conveniently omitting the part where you had no say in the matter. You'd be remembered as brave, chosen, and favoured by the gods, which is a nice spin on unfortunate lottery winner. If you were a captive warrior, your story took on an extra layer of prestige. The fact that you'd fought valiantly before your capture meant you'd be honoured not just for dying, but for proving your worth on the battlefield. Songs and poems might even immortalise you, though these would focus more on your valour and less on the part where your heart was raised to the sky. Your likeness might appear in painted codices, surrounded by symbols indicating your role in the festival. In these illustrations, you'd look calm, noble, and perfectly composed. Artists tended to skip over the messy reality in favour of something spiritually uplifting. Centuries later, historians would study these images and note your contribution without ever knowing if you were inwardly screaming the whole time. In the eyes of the community, your sacrifice was the ultimate act of giving. The rains that fell, the crops that grew, the victories in war, all of it was, in part, thanks to you. People might invoke your spirit in prayers, hoping you'd put in a good word with the gods. Of course, outside the Aztec world, the memory was a little less flattering. Spanish chroniclers would write about sacrifices in horrified tones, turning you into a cautionary tale about barbaric customs. Over time, the meaning of your death would be filtered through outsiders' perspectives, some seeing it as noble, others as brutal. Still, for the people of Tenochtitlan, you weren't just a victim. You were a hero, a vital thread in the vast tapestry of cosmic order. It's just that your heroic career was also very, very short. If there was one silver lining to being an Aztec sacrifice, it was the afterlife package. The Aztecs didn't believe in a one-size-fits-all eternity. Instead, where you ended up depended on how you died. And for those offered to the gods in a grand ceremony, the destination was surprisingly prestigious. Your soul's first stop was not some shadowy underworld full of misery. Instead, you were believed to be escorted to the realm of the god you'd been sacrificed to. If it was Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, congratulations, you'd join him on his daily journey across the sky. In fact, for the first 4 years, you'd accompany him from sunrise to noon, fighting off cosmic monsters. After that, you'd get to return to Earth as a hummingbird or butterfly. Not bad, considering the alternative was eternal darkness. If you were sacrificed to Tlaloc, the rain god, your afterlife perks included a lush, paradise-like realm filled with endless greenery, sparkling streams, and, presumably, a total absence of obsidian knives. This watery paradise, known as Tlalocan, was essentially the Aztec version of a luxury resort, minus the swim-up bar. The point was clear. You didn't just vanish into nothingness. Your soul had a role, a purpose, and in many ways, more adventure ahead. In the Aztec worldview, your death was less of an ending and more of a high-status transfer to the divine department. There was also a social bonus. You'd be remembered during festivals, with your name or symbolic likeness included in rituals. People might even call on you for spiritual assistance, imagining you whispering to the gods on their behalf. You went from person in the crowd to permanent member of the cosmic VIP list. Of course, whether you personally felt that these perks balanced out the whole having your heart removed thing is another matter, but for the Aztecs, this was the ultimate honor. In their eyes, your sacrifice wasn't tragic. It was a ticket to an exclusive eternity most people could never dream of. So in a sense, you didn't just die for your people. You got promoted. It's just that the promotion process was abrupt. On paper, or more accurately on painted codex, being an Aztec sacrifice looked like a noble gig. You got paraded through the city, dressed in fine clothes, fed well in your final days, and given a front row seat to the most sacred ceremonies of the year. You'd be remembered as a hero, immortalized in stories, and fast-tracked to a divine afterlife. But the job description had some fine print. The kind printed so small that you only realized it existed when you were halfway up the temple steps. Yes, the perks were undeniable. But so was the part where you lost your heart before lunch. The problem wasn't just the ending. It was the lack of personal choice. Sacrifice victims didn't exactly sign consent forms. Whether you were a captured warrior, a tribute from a conquered town, or even someone chosen in a festival lottery, you didn't get much say in your career trajectory. The gods needed fuel, and you happened to be in the right or wrong place at the right time. Then there was the pressure. Sure, you were told this was an honor, but the unspoken truth was that if anything went wrong during the ritual, the priests weren't the ones who'd get blamed. It'd be your spirit. Imagine carrying the cosmic guilt of a bad harvest just because you flinched at the wrong moment. And while the afterlife benefits were generous, they came with conditions. 4 years as a celestial warrior might sound glamorous, but battling mythic creatures every day before lunch could get exhausting. Returning to Earth as a hummingbird was charming in theory, but one hungry frog could ruin your entire reincarnation. In the end, the reality of being an Aztec sacrifice was simple. It was a role designed to look glorious to everyone except the person in it. The community saw you as a savior. You probably saw it as a very permanent scheduling conflict. So yes, the songs, dances, and eternal honor were lovely. But if given the choice, you'd probably prefer to cheer from the crowd rather than take center stage. Sometimes the greatest wisdom is knowing when to let someone else be the hero. Long before tea became the poetic symbol of elegance and conversation in Chinese culture, it was a humble leaf with a job to do: keep you alive, alert, and hopefully free from stomach troubles. In the Han Dynasty, which began in 206 BCE, tea wasn't sipped for pleasure. It was boiled like medicine, because that's exactly what it was considered to be. Picture a Han Dynasty apothecary, shelves lined with jars of dried roots, barks, and leaves. Somewhere in there, tea leaves, freshly plucked from the misty hills, waited their turn. Physicians recommended them not because they were fragrant or delicate, but because they believed the brew could ease digestion, reduce fatigue, and cleanse the body of excess heat. You didn't curl up with a cup of tea for comfort back then. You grimaced, swallowed, and hoped it worked. The preparation was also far from the refined brewing rituals of later centuries. The leaves were steamed, then pressed into hard, portable bricks, a form that made them easy to store and transport. These bricks could be shaved into small pieces and tossed into boiling water with an assortment of other ingredients: scallions for warmth, ginger for spice, and even dried citrus peel for a tangy edge. The resulting liquid was more like a hearty herbal soup than the delicate drink modern tea lovers would recognize. Tea also carried a subtle social weight. In the Han court, offering a medicinal tea was a gesture of care and refinement, even if the flavor was questionable. It was a way of saying, "I respect your health," rather than, "Let's enjoy this moment together." The drink's medicinal associations meant it appeared in early medical texts, where scholars carefully documented which ailments it was supposed to treat. Yet even at this early stage, tea had begun its slow transformation. The more it was consumed, the more people grew accustomed to its taste. Over time, some began to enjoy its bitterness, associating it with vitality and clarity of mind. The Han Dynasty may have treated tea as medicine first and foremost, but it was here, in those steaming, pungent pots, that the seeds of China's tea culture were planted. By the time the Tang Dynasty arrived in the 7th century CE, tea had undergone a transformation worthy of a royal makeover. No longer just a bitter medicinal concoction, it had evolved into a drink of refinement, artistry, and, most importantly, pleasure. The Tang court embraced tea as both a daily habit and a cultural statement, and with imperial approval, tea culture flourished. One of the most influential figures in this era was Lu Yu, a scholar monk who became known as the Sage of Tea. Around 760 CE, he wrote the classic of tea, Cha Jing, the first known treatise devoted entirely to tea. This wasn't just a recipe book, it was a complete philosophy. Lu Yu described the ideal growing conditions for tea plants, the proper methods for processing leaves, and the etiquette of preparing and serving tea. In doing so, he elevated tea from a mere beverage to an art form. Tang-era tea was still quite different from the loose-leaf style familiar today. The leaves were steamed, pounded into cakes, and dried. When ready to drink, a piece of the cake would be broken off, ground into powder, and whisked into hot water, sometimes with salt or spices, depending on the region. This method created a frothy, rich infusion that symbolized harmony and refinement. The Tang capital, Chang'an, became a hub for tea appreciation. Tea houses began to appear, public spaces where scholars, merchants, and travelers could gather to drink, talk politics, recite poetry, or simply watch the city's bustle. These establishments weren't just cafes, they were cultural crossroads. Diplomats from Korea, Japan, and the Middle East encountered Chinese tea here and carried both the drink and its traditions back to their homelands. For the aristocracy, tea gatherings became a form of social display. The right utensils, the right water source, the right poetic mood, these details mattered. Serving tea poorly could be a social faux pas. Serving it perfectly was a mark of refinement. Even the act of pouring became graceful, deliberate, almost theatrical. By the end of the Tang dynasty, tea was no longer just a medicinal brew. It was a symbol of intellectual elegance, hospitality, and cultural sophistication. From the imperial court to the bustling tea houses of Chang'an, the Tang set the stage for the tea traditions that would shape China and much of Asia for centuries to come. If the Tang dynasty gave tea its cultural foundation, the Song dynasty, 960–1279, draped it in silk and gold. The Song elite approached tea like fine art. Every leaf, every cup, and every motion of the hand was part of a refined performance. In this era, tea drinking reached a new level of sophistication, and the style was unlike anything you'd see in modern tea houses. The tea of choice was powdered, much like the Tang eras, but the Song perfected the whisked method. Instead of boiling tea cakes in water, they ground the tea into a fine green powder, placed it in delicate porcelain bowls, added hot water, and whisked it briskly with bamboo. The result was a pale jade-green froth that was as pleasing to the eye as it was to the palate. This method would later inspire Japan's chanoyu, or tea ceremony. Tea gatherings became a kind of competitive art form known as dusha, or tea contests. Participants were judged on the colour and foam of their whisked tea. The finest foam was dense, smooth, and lasted the longest, sometimes holding its form long enough for poetry to be written on its surface. A thin or quickly dissipating foam. That was the tea equivalent of showing up to a royal banquet in muddy shoes. The Song emperors themselves were deeply involved in tea culture. Emperor Huizong, an accomplished calligrapher and painter, even wrote a treatise titled Daguan Chalun, Treatise on Tea, detailing the aesthetics of tea preparation. Under his reign, tea became an emblem of imperial refinement, and owning the finest tea bowls from kilns like Jianware was a matter of prestige. Tea was also tied to the visual arts. Painters depicted serene scholars sipping tea in bamboo groves, while poets used tea as a metaphor for purity, clarity, and the fleeting nature of life. In elegant pavilions by lotus ponds, courtiers exchanged verses over steaming bowls, the frothy green surface reflecting the surrounding beauty. For commoners, tea drinking was simpler but still influenced by the elite. Street vendors sold whisked tea in busy markets, and though the bowls might not have been imperial porcelain, the drink carried the same warmth and energy. The Song dynasty turned tea into a visual, tactile, and poetic experience, less about quenching thirst, more about cultivating beauty. By the time the dynasty fell, tea drinking had become inseparable from the ideals of elegance, artistry, and refined living. When the Mongols swept into China and established the Yuan dynasty, 1271–1368, they brought with them new tastes, customs, and a far more practical approach to food and drink. For tea culture, this meant a shift away from the refined, whisked style of the Song and toward heartier, more utilitarian brews. The Mongols were horse-riding conquerors. not porcelain polishing aesthetes, and their influence reshaped tea into something bolder, more sustaining. Under Mongol rule, compressed tea cakes made a comeback, this time not just for storage but for travel and trade across the vast Mongol Empire. Caravans carried tea bricks along the Silk Road, and they became a form of currency in some regions. In the steppes, tea was often boiled with milk, salt, and sometimes butter, creating a rich, savory drink designed to nourish rather than dazzle. This was tea as fuel, not art. Still, the Yuan dynasty didn't erase the earlier traditions entirely. In the cities, particularly in former Song cultural centers, the love for elegant tea preparation lingered among scholars and merchants. Tea houses continued to operate, but the competitive whisking contests of the Song largely disappeared, replaced by simpler brewing methods. Interestingly, the Mongol palate influenced tea flavoring. Spices like cardamom, cloves, and even black pepper occasionally found their way into tea, flavors borrowed from Central Asian and Middle Eastern culinary traditions. This created blends far removed from the delicate green froth of the Song era, but they had their own appeal, especially for travelers and traders who associated these spiced brews with the cosmopolitan roots of the empire. The Yuan also expanded tea's geographical reach. Through the Mongol postal and trade networks, Chinese tea traveled farther than ever before, into Persia, Russia, and beyond. Though these regions would adapt the drink to their own cultures, the Yuan period marked the beginning of tea's truly global journey. In the eyes of the refined tea connoisseurs of earlier dynasties, this might have been a cultural step backward, less poetry, more practicality. But the Mongols were nothing if not pragmatic, and under their rule, tea proved its versatility. Whether in an urban tea house or a windswept yurt on the steppe, tea in the Yuan dynasty was about sustaining life in a vast and demanding empire. When the Ming dynasty took power in 1368, they didn't just restore Chinese rule, they restored elegance to tea. Gone were the frothy whisked powders of the Song and the milk-salted brews of the Yuan. The Ming court ushered in a simpler, more graceful approach, loose-leaf brewing. The shift came largely thanks to Emperor Hongwu, the dynasty's founder. Practical to the core, he issued a decree banning the production of compressed tea cakes, favoring whole leaves instead. The change transformed the entire tea industry. Farmers began cultivating leaves specifically for loose brewing, developing new varieties with delicate aromas and subtle flavors that could shine without being ground or heavily flavored. Loose-leaf brewing changed everything about the drinking experience. Instead of whisking powder into a foamy suspension, tea drinkers now placed whole leaves into a pot, poured hot water over them, and let them steep. This method allowed the natural shape, fragrance, and color of the leaves to be appreciated, a more direct connection to the plant itself. It was tea stripped back to its essence. The Ming also revolutionized teaware. With powdered tea no longer the norm, bowls gave way to teapots, and the humble clay pot became an art form. In Yixing, artisans crafted unglazed clay teapots that absorbed the essence of the tea over time, enhancing its flavor. Porcelain makers in Jingdezhen produced fine, thin-walled teacups that showcased the clear liquor of green teas. A well-brewed cup wasn't just tasted, it was admired like a painting. Culturally, tea became an even more intimate companion to scholarship and the arts. Poets described the sound of water boiling as a wind in the pines. Painters depicted solitary scholars brewing tea in mountain retreats, using the act as a metaphor for clarity of thought. Even among common folk, tea drinking became more accessible. Loose leaves could be brewed without elaborate equipment, and roadside tea stalls flourished in towns and villages. During this era, regional teas began to develop distinct reputations. Dragonwell from Hangzhou, Biluochun from Jiangsu, and countless others. Merchants competed to supply the finest harvests to the court, creating the early outlines of China's famous tea trade. The Ming dynasty's embrace of loose-leaf brewing didn't just refine tea, it set the standard for how much of the world still enjoys it today. From elegant yixing pots to the first flush of green leaves in spring, the Ming made tea a celebration of purity, simplicity, and the beauty of nature itself. When the Qing dynasty rose to power in 1644, tea was already the soul of Chinese daily life. But under Qing rule, tea would leap beyond China's borders, becoming one of the most sought-after commodities in the world. What began as a local cultural treasure was now on its way to fueling empires, wars, and global trade networks. Domestically, the Qing court maintained tea's role as a symbol of refinement. The emperors, especially Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, were connoisseurs who supported both the cultivation of fine teas and the artistry of teaware. This period saw further refinement of varieties like Tie Guanyin Oolong and the development of elaborate brewing techniques that balanced aroma, flavor, and appearance. But it was beyond China's borders that tea's influence truly exploded. The Qing dynasty oversaw an unprecedented expansion of the tea trade with foreign powers. By the 17th century, Dutch and Portuguese traders had introduced tea to Europe, but it was during the Qing era that British demand skyrocketed. Chests of tea left the port of Canton in massive quantities, bound for London and beyond. The British East India Company became a major customer, paying for tea with silver, and later, controversially, with opium, setting the stage for conflict. Alongside green tea, black tea, known in China as Hongcha, gained prominence. Black tea's longer shelf life made it ideal for long voyages, and varieties like Lapsang Souchong found eager markets abroad. The Qing also introduced compressed pu'er tea to Tibet, Mongolia, and Central Asia, where it was traded for horses and other goods. Tea houses flourished within China, becoming centers not only for drinking, but for opera performances, business negotiations, and social gatherings. In Beijing, a tea house might serve as both a cafe and an informal office, while in southern China, the Cantonese tradition of yum cha, tea paired with dim sum, blossomed into a beloved culinary ritual. By the late Qing, however, the once profitable tea trade had a darker side. Britain's opium imports into China, designed to offset the silver drain caused by tea exports, led to widespread addiction and the Opium Wars. Tea, once a gentle cultural ambassador, was now entangled in geopolitics. Even so, the Qing dynasty had cemented tea's place as a global commodity. From the drawing rooms of London to the monasteries of Tibet, tea carried with it the essence of Chinese tradition, even as it became a force that would reshape world history. In China, tea was never just about quenching thirst, it was a mirror for the soul. By the time centuries of dynasties had passed, tea drinking had woven itself into the fabric of Chinese philosophy, merging seamlessly with Taoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. A simple cup of tea could be an act of meditation, a lesson in virtue, and a reflection on the fleeting nature of life. Buddhist monks were among the earliest to embrace tea for spiritual purposes. Monasteries, often perched high in mist-covered mountains, cultivated tea to help monks stay awake during long hours of meditation. The quiet act of brewing became a kind of moving meditation itself. Rinsing the leaves, pouring the water, watching the steam curl into the air. In the stillness of the tea room, the world outside dissolved, and the drinker's mind was anchored in the present moment. Taoist influence infused tea with a sense of harmony between humanity and nature. The best teas were grown in remote, unspoiled landscapes, where mist, soil, and climate worked in perfect balance. Sipping tea was seen as a way to absorb that balance into one's own being, nature's qi made tangible. The appreciation of tea's aroma, taste, and afterglow reflected Taoist ideals of simplicity and purity. Confucian scholars brought another layer of meaning. For them, tea was a symbol of civility, moral discipline, and respectful social interaction. A host offering tea to a guest was performing more than hospitality. It was a small act of moral cultivation. In the Confucian tradition, the tea table became a stage for manners, poetry, and intellectual exchange, where the quality of one's character was judged as much by the conversation as by the leaves in the pot. Philosophers and poets often used tea as a metaphor. A good cup was like a virtuous life, clear, balanced, and free from excess. A poor brew, cloudy and bitter, could stand as a warning against haste or greed. Some wrote of tea's second flavour, the lingering sweetness after bitterness, as a reminder that life's difficulties often yield quiet rewards. By blending physical refreshment with moral and spiritual reflection, tea became more than a drink. It was a bridge between body and mind, self and world. Every sip carried centuries of thought, a silent dialogue between nature, wisdom, and the human heart. If monasteries gave tea its spiritual depth, tea houses gave it a heartbeat. By the height of the Ming and Qing dynasties, tea houses had become an inseparable part of Chinese urban life. Bustling, noisy, and alive with the sounds of clinking cups, shuffling tiles, and heated debate. These establishments came in many shapes and sizes. In big cities like Beijing or Hangzhou, there were elegant, multi-story tea houses where silk-robed patrons could sip rare brews served in fine porcelain, attended by servers who seemed to glide rather than walk. In smaller towns and rural markets, there were humble roadside stalls, just a few benches, a kettle over a charcoal brazier, and a proprietor who knew everyone's preferred brew. Tea houses were never just about the drink. They were the living rooms of the city, places where merchants negotiated deals, scholars exchanged poetry, storytellers spun epic tales, and amateur actors performed snippets of opera. In bustling Chengdu, some tea houses even offered ear-cleaning services alongside refills, turning a tea visit into a full sensory experience. The atmosphere varied with the clientele. Scholars' tea houses were quiet, punctuated by the scratch of calligraphy brushes and the low hum of philosophical discussion. Merchant tea houses buzzed with the sharp talk of business, the air thick with incense and ambition. The common tea house was a democratic space where farmers, labourers, and travellers could share a table and a story for the price of a single pot. Entertainment was a major draw. Tea houses often hired performers, musicians, acrobats, or actors to keep patrons lingering. Storytelling was especially popular, with skilled narrators holding audiences spellbound for hours, their voices rising and falling like the steam from the kettle. Patrons sipped slowly, unwilling to leave before the tale's final twist. Hospitality was a point of pride. A skilled tea master didn't just brew leaves, they read the room. A weary traveller might be offered a bold, restorative black tea, while a refined guest might receive a delicate green in a cup warmed just so. In a society where public life was often regulated and formal, the tea house was a rare space of fluidity, a melting pot where social boundaries softened over shared cups. Whether in the grandeur of a capital or the dust of a roadside stop, tea houses kept the rhythm of the community, one pour at a time. From its humble beginnings as a medicinal brew in the Han Dynasty, to the refined loose-leaf rituals of the Ming and the global trade networks of the Qing, tea has remained one of China's most enduring cultural treasures. Its journey through the centuries is more than just a story about a drink. It is a reflection of China's values, philosophies, and adaptability. Tea became a unifying thread across a vast and diverse empire. In the remote mountains of Yunnan, farmers plucked wild leaves from ancient tea trees. In the imperial palace, connoisseurs debated the merits of spring versus autumn harvests. Rich or poor, scholar or farmer, emperor or merchant, tea was a common language that bridged social divides. Its symbolism ran deep. Tea embodied harmony, balance, and the appreciation of life's subtleties. It was tied to Confucian ideals of respect and civility, Taoist notions of simplicity and connection to nature, and Buddhist practices of mindfulness. In every dynasty, tea adapted to the needs of its time, whether as medicine, art, trade, or spiritual companion, without ever losing its essential identity. Tea also became a vessel for Chinese craftsmanship. The art of porcelain making in Jingdezhen, the earthy elegance of Yixing clay teapots, the intricate bamboo whisks, and the poetic inscriptions on teacups. These were not mere accessories, but expressions of a culture that understood beauty as inseparable from function. Even beyond China's borders, tea carried with it the imprint of its homeland. From Japan's tea ceremony to Britain's afternoon tea, from Tibetan butter tea to Moroccan mint tea, the leaf's journey always led back to China's misty mountains and meticulous cultivation. In the modern era, tea continues to evolve. Contemporary tea houses blend tradition with innovation, offering cold brews, scented teas, and experimental blends alongside centuries-old classics. Yet, at its core, the act of brewing remains timeless, heating the water, releasing the leaves' aroma, and taking that first thoughtful sip. Tea's endurance lies in its dual nature. It is both ordinary and extraordinary, an everyday drink and a ritual, a simple leaf and a cultural emblem. To drink tea in China is not just to taste a beverage, but to take part in a tradition that has flowed unbroken for over 2,000 years, carrying with it the wisdom, artistry, and soul of a civilization. In ancient Greece, athletic competition was never just about glory for the athlete. It was an act of worship. Sport was woven into religion, and the track, the wrestling pit, and the chariot course were as sacred in their own way as the temples that stood nearby. To compete was to honor the gods, and victory was considered a sign that the divine had smiled upon you. The most famous example of this union between faith and sport was the Olympic Games, first recorded in 776 BCE. These were not just casual contests, they were held in Olympia, a sanctuary dedicated to Zeus, king of the gods. Before the games began, athletes, officials, and even spectators participated in elaborate religious rituals. At the altar of Zeus, bulls were sacrificed, prayers were recited, and offerings of incense filled the air. The stadium and the temple were two sides of the same coin, both designed to draw the favor of the divine. Other festivals followed a similar pattern. The Pythian Games at Delphi honored Apollo, featuring not just athletics, but also music and poetry competitions. The Isthmian Games celebrated Poseidon, god of the sea, fitting for a venue near the water. Each god had their own set of games, rules, and symbolic connections. To win at the Nemean Games, dedicated to Zeus and Heracles, wasn't just a personal triumph. It was proof that your strength and skill aligned with the heroic virtues those deities embodied. Athletes themselves approached competition with a sense of religious duty. Many trained in gymnasia attached to sanctuaries, and before an event, they swore oaths before the gods to compete honorably. Cheating or dishonorable conduct was not merely a breach of sporting etiquette, it was sacrilege. Punishments could include public shaming, fines, and the erection of statues called zanes, funded by the fines, to remind everyone of the gods' disapproval. Victories were celebrated with both earthly and divine rewards. Winners received olive wreaths or crowns of laurel, symbols tied to the gods, and often dedicated a portion of their prizes, or even statues of themselves, to the sanctuaries. In doing so, they made their success part of the temple's legacy, ensuring their name and deeds would be remembered in both mortal and divine realms. In short, athletics in ancient Greece was a sacred conversation between human ambition and divine will, a test of strength, speed, and skill offered up to the heavens. If the games themselves were the grand stage, the gymnasium was the rehearsal hall where champions were forged. In ancient Greece, the gymnasium was far more than a place to work up a sweat. It was a hub of education, philosophy, and civic pride. Training the body and training the mind went hand in hand, and both were considered essential to being a complete citizen. The word gymnasium comes from gymnos, meaning naked, because athletes trained without clothing. This wasn't for shock value, it was a practical choice that allowed freedom of movement and celebrated the idealized human form. In the Greek worldview, a well-trained body was an outward sign of inner discipline, balance, and harmony. Gymnasia were open-air complexes, often built near sanctuaries, with running tracks, wrestling pits, and spaces for discus and javelin practice. They also included shaded porticos and gardens where athletes could cool down, discuss philosophy, or listen to lectures from prominent thinkers. Some of history's greatest philosophers, including Plato and Aristotle, spent time teaching or training in these spaces, seeing physical exercise as part of a well-rounded education. Training was strict and highly specialized. Young athletes, often starting in their teens, followed regimens designed by experienced trainers known as paidotribai. These instructors oversaw drills for strength, agility, and endurance, tailoring exercises to the demands of specific events, whether sprinting, wrestling, or pancration. Nutrition was also a part of the discipline. Athletes consumed diets rich in bread, cheese, figs, and sometimes meat, paired with wine diluted with water. Competition for a spot in the great festivals was fierce. Months before the games, athletes gathered for intense training at designated sites, living together under supervision. They swore oaths to Zeus to train honestly and refrain from cheating, and the pressure to prove oneself worthy was immense. But gymnasia were not exclusive to elite athletes. They were civic centers for male citizens. Even those who never competed in the Olympics could train for personal fitness, socialize, and engage in political discussion. Friendships, rivalries, and alliances were all forged in these spaces, making them as much about community as competition. In the Greek mind, the gymnasium wasn't just where you built muscles, it was where you shaped character. The dust of the wrestling floor, the rhythm of pounding feet on the track, and the hum of philosophical debate all merged into a single unified ideal, the pursuit of excellence in body and mind. Every 4 years, the sanctuary of Olympia transformed into the beating heart of the Greek world. The Olympic Games, first recorded in 776 BCE, were not just athletic contests. They were a unifying celebration of religion, culture, and shared identity. For the duration of the festival, city-states set aside their rivalries, and a sacred truce, the Ekacheria, was declared so that athletes and spectators could travel safely to Olympia without fear of war. The event lasted 5 days, but its impact was eternal. Before a single race or match began, the focus was on ritual. Athletes, judges, and officials processed to the great altar of Zeus, where they offered sacrifices and swore solemn oaths to compete fairly. These promises were made before the god's colossal statue, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a constant reminder that victory was a divine favor not just human achievement. The games themselves included a range of events: foot races, long jump, discus and javelin throws, wrestling, boxing, the grueling pancration, a no-holds-barred blend of wrestling and striking, and the prestigious chariot races. Each discipline tested a different facet of human endurance, speed, and skill, and every competitor represented not just themselves, but their home city-state's honor. Spectators filled the stadium, their cheers echoing off the surrounding hills. Merchants set up stalls, poets recited verses, and philosophers engaged in debates under the olive trees. For many, attending the Olympics was as much a social and cultural pilgrimage as a sporting event. Winners received an olive wreath cut from a sacred tree in Zeus's sanctuary. Though it held no monetary value, the honor it bestowed was priceless. Returning home, victors were celebrated like heroes. Parades, feasts, and sometimes even free meals for life awaited them. Statues might be erected in their image, and their names would be remembered for generations. But the glory of the Olympics wasn't limited to the winners. Simply competing on Olympia's sacred ground was an honor, proof of exceptional skill and discipline. To the Greeks, these games were a living testament to arete, the pursuit of excellence, and a reminder that in striving for greatness, humans could reflect the divine. The Olympic Games were more than a festival. They were a mirror of Greek ideals, where athletic triumph and sacred ritual intertwined in a celebration that resonated across centuries. If the foot race was the purest test of human speed, chariot racing was the most thrilling and the most dangerous spectacle of the ancient Greek games. Held in the Hippodrome, a massive oval track designed for horses and chariots, these races combined athletic skill, animal mastery, and sheer nerve. Victory could bring immense prestige, but the path to it was lined with dust, danger, and broken wheels. Chariot races were among the marquee events of festivals like the Olympics, the Pythian Games, and the Panathenaic Games in Athens. The competition was fierce, not only because of the glory at stake, but because these events attracted the wealthiest and most ambitious patrons. Unlike foot races, where the athlete competed for personal fame, chariot racing allowed owners, often aristocrats or even monarchs, to win without ever stepping onto the track. Professional drivers, or charioteers, risked their lives to secure victory for their patrons. The chariots themselves were light, two-wheeled vehicles made of wood and leather, built for speed rather than safety. Teams of 2 or 4 horses were harnessed to the chariot, and the driver had to control them with remarkable precision, especially around the dangerous turning posts, or nisai. These sharp turns were notorious for causing collisions, and a single mistake could send chariots careening into each other in a chaotic tangle of wheels, hooves, and splintered wood. Races could last several laps, with strategies shifting between bursts of speed and careful positioning to avoid crashes. Drivers leaned their bodies to guide the chariot, sometimes wrapping the reins around their waists for extra control, a technique that could prove fatal if the chariot overturned. For the victors, the rewards were immense. The owner's name, not the driver's, was announced as the winner, and their prestige skyrocketed. Victorious patrons often commissioned monuments, statues, and victory odes by famous poets like Pindar to immortalize their triumph. For drivers, especially slaves or lower-born professionals, a win could mean manumission, wealth, and enduring fame within the racing world. The spectacle drew massive crowds. The thunder of hooves, the creak of wheels, and the shouts of the crowd created an atmosphere of pure adrenaline. Chariot racing blended the elegance of horsemanship with the raw thrill of danger, making it one of the most unforgettable and high-stakes traditions in ancient Greek sport. If wrestling tested strength and boxing tested endurance, pancration tested everything: strength, skill, toughness, and above all, sheer will to win. Introduced to the Olympic Games in 648 BCE, this brutal blend of wrestling and striking was considered the pinnacle of Greek combat sports. The name itself means all power, or complete strength, and the rules were simple. Almost anything was allowed. Competitors could punch, kick, trip, throw, choke, or twist joints to force submission. Wrestling grips were combined with boxing blows, and fighters constantly shifted between standing strikes and ground grappling. The only officially banned moves were biting and eye gouging, though even these prohibitions were occasionally ignored in the heat of competition. There were no timed rounds, no weight classes, and no protective gear. Matches continued until one man submitted by raising a finger or was rendered unconscious. This could take minutes, or drag on for hours under the punishing sun. The only real referees were judges armed with switches to strike rule breakers, though in Pankration, the definition of rule breaking was already quite flexible. Training for Pankration demanded more than raw muscle. Fighters honed their bodies through a mix of wrestling drills, boxing sparring, and conditioning that included running, lifting stones, and practicing holds in sand pits. Equally important was mental preparation. Pancratiasts were trained to endure pain, remain calm under pressure, and exploit every small opening in an opponent's defences. The sport produced legendary figures, such as Narration of Figalia, who won an Olympic crown in 564 BCE under extraordinary and grim circumstances. In his final match, Narration was caught in a chokehold, but managed to dislocate his opponent's ankle. His rival surrendered, granting Narration victory, only for it to be discovered that the champion had died from the choke. He was still crowned posthumously, a testament to the Greeks' reverence for determination. Pankration wasn't just sport, it was also preparation for war. Many techniques mirrored those used in real combat, and the ability to subdue an enemy without weapons was highly valued. It blurred the line between athletics and martial skill, embodying the Greek belief that a true man must be ready for both the games and the battlefield. For spectators, Pankration was both thrilling and terrifying, a raw display of human endurance and ferocity. It stood as the ultimate test of an athlete's physical and mental limits, and those who triumphed in its unforgiving arena were immortalized as warriors in every sense of the word. In a world where specialization often brought glory, the pentathlon crowned the most complete athlete of them all. Introduced to the Olympic Games in 708 BCE, this five-event competition tested speed, strength, skill, and adaptability, qualities prized both on the athletic field and the battlefield. Winning the pentathlon was a statement. You weren't just good at one thing, you excelled at everything. The pentathlon consisted of the stadium foot race, long jump, discus throw, javelin throw, and wrestling. Unlike today's decathlon, the events were held in a single day, demanding both explosive power and endurance from the competitors. The exact order varied, but the contest typically began with the running event to test raw speed. The stadion race, about 180-200 meters, was a sprint that required a perfect balance between pace and control. Overexertion early could ruin an athlete's performance in the later events. The long jump, performed with the aid of small weights called halteres, tested coordination and leg strength. Athletes swung the halteres forward to gain momentum before leaping into a sandpit, releasing them just before landing. The discus and javelin throws followed, each requiring a blend of technique and muscle. The discus was a heavy, circular stone or metal plate, while the javelin, a long wooden spear tipped with bronze, was launched with the help of a leather strap for greater distance. The final event was wrestling, and it often decided the champion. Here, technique and endurance became crucial, especially after a full day of exertion. The wrestling match in the pentathlon was less brutal than pankration, but still physically demanding, with the goal of throwing the opponent to the ground 3 times. Victory in the pentathlon didn't just prove physical versatility, it reflected the Greek ideal of arete, excellence in all things. The skills mirrored those needed by a hoplite soldier, running into battle, leaping over obstacles, throwing weapons with precision, and grappling with enemies in close combat. This made the pentathlon not just an athletic challenge, but a demonstration of martial readiness. Because of its demanding variety, the pentathlon was considered one of the most prestigious events in the Games. Poets praised its winners as the embodiment of the balanced Greek spirit, capable of adapting to any challenge. In the eyes of the spectators, a pentathlon victor wasn't merely an athlete, he was the living image of physical harmony, discipline, and versatility. While most ancient Greek athletic festivals were dominated by male competitors, there was one notable exception: the Heraean Games. Held at Olympia and dedicated to Hera, queen of the gods, these competitions gave women, specifically unmarried women, a rare chance to demonstrate their athletic ability on a public stage. Though smaller in scale than the Olympic Games, the Heraean Games carried religious and cultural significance of their own. The festival's central event was foot racing, conducted in the same stadium used for the Olympics, but with a slightly shorter track. According to tradition, the racecourse for the Heraean Games was reduced by about 1/6 of the Olympic length, possibly to reflect a symbolic distinction between the male and female competitions. Competitors wore short, sleeveless tunics that reached just above the knee, and their right shoulder was left bare, allowing for freedom of movement. The Heraean Games were divided into age categories, allowing younger and older girls to compete separately. As with the men's Olympics, winning was an immense honor. Victors were awarded olive crowns, much like their male counterparts, and could dedicate statues or offerings to Hera within her sanctuary at Olympia. This connection between sport and piety was as strong for the Heraean Games as it was for the male-dominated festivals. The origins of the Heraean Games were deeply tied to myth and ritual. According to legend, the event was established by Hippodamia, the wife of King Pelops, in gratitude to Hera for her marriage. Another tradition claimed that 16 women from Elis organized the games to honor Hera after mediating a political dispute. Whatever the origin, the festival reinforced Hera's role as a guardian of marriage and womanhood, even though the participants were unmarried girls. Training for the Heraean Games is less well documented than for men's athletics, but it likely involved running drills, physical conditioning, and perhaps participation in local games before traveling to Olympia. These competitions gave young women a sanctioned space to engage in physical activity within a society that often restricted female athleticism. Though the Heraean Games never rivaled the Olympics in scale or fame, they remain significant as a reminder that athletic competition in ancient Greece, while overwhelmingly male-focused, was not exclusively so. For the young women who raced along Olympia's track, the Heraean Games were more than sport. They were a rare opportunity to earn honor, connect with the divine, and step briefly into the public spotlight. In ancient Greece, athletics and warfare were two sides of the same coin. The skills honed on the running track, wrestling ground, and throwing field were not just for sport. They were the foundation of a soldier's training. The Greek city-state, or polis, expected its male citizens to be ready for war at a moment's notice, and athletic discipline was viewed as essential preparation for the hoplite phalanx. From youth, boys were introduced to physical training through the agoge in Sparta or local gymnasia elsewhere in Greece. Running built the stamina needed to march long distances in armor. Wrestling and pankration taught close-quarters combat skills, conditioning men to grapple with opponents while wearing heavy gear. Javelin throwing developed the precision and strength required for spear use in battle, while discus throwing trained the arms, shoulders, and torso for the repetitive motions of weapon handling. Sparta is perhaps the clearest example of athletics as military preparation. Spartan boys began state-controlled training at the age of 7, living in barracks, enduring harsh discipline, and engaging in daily athletic drills. Their races might be run in armor, and their wrestling bouts were often rougher than those in civilian gymnasia. The goal was not to create champions for the games. It was to produce soldiers who could endure exhaustion, pain, and fear. Even in less militaristic city-states like Athens, the link between athletics and defense was strong. The ephebic training program, which young men entered at around 18, combined physical exercise with weapons training, ensuring they could run, fight, and maneuver effectively in the line of battle. Festivals and games also reinforced the martial spirit. Many athletic events mirrored battlefield movements, and victory brought prestige that could translate into leadership roles within the polis. A champion wrestler or runner was not only admired for his skill, he was seen as a capable and courageous defender of his homeland. The Greek ideal of arete, excellence, applied equally to athletics and war. To neglect one was to weaken the other. This belief ensured that physical training was woven into the fabric of civic life, from schoolyards to gymnasia to the great festival arenas. In the end, Greek athletics were never purely games. They were rehearsals for the most serious contest of all, the defense of the city-state. On the field of sport, men learned the strength, discipline, and unity they would need when the stakes were far higher than olive wreaths. The athletic traditions of ancient Greece did not vanish with the last Olympiad of antiquity. They left a cultural imprint that continues to shape sport, competition, and physical education to this day. From the ideals of fair play to the spectacle of organized games, the Greek approach to athletics laid the groundwork for much of the modern sporting world. Central to this legacy was the concept of arete, or excellence, which held that true achievement came from perfecting both body and mind. This ideal survives in the modern Olympic motto, Citius, Altius, Fortius, faster, higher, stronger, which mirrors the Greek pursuit of pushing human limits. While today's athletes compete for medals instead of olive wreaths, the principle of striving for personal and collective glory remains the same. The structure of international sporting events also owes much to Greece. The quadrennial cycle of the modern Olympic Games directly mirrors the ancient schedule, and events like wrestling, discus, javelin, and long jump still feature prominently, preserved in forms remarkably close to their classical origins. Even the idea of bringing athletes together from across nations for peaceful competition echoes the ancient Olympic truce, when Greek city-states set aside conflicts to gather in Olympia. Greek influence extended beyond the games themselves. The gymnasium, once a training ground for both the body and intellect, inspired modern sports facilities and physical education systems. The belief that physical fitness was a civic duty, as well as a personal pursuit, still underpins many national athletic programs. The ancient Greek emphasis on spectatorship also foreshadowed modern sports culture. Just as stadiums in Olympia or Athens drew massive crowds for chariot races, foot races, and combat sports, today's arenas, broadcast networks, and online platforms carry the same energy to a global audience. The spectacle of athletic achievement remains as captivating now as it was 2,000 years ago. Even the ethical dilemmas of sport, cheating, professionalism, nationalism, were debated in Greece. Ancient athletes faced penalties for bribery or dishonorable conduct, and the discussions surrounding fairness and sportsmanship continue in our own era. From anti-doping rules to questions about technology in competition, Ultimately, the athletic traditions of ancient Greece endure because they were never just about winning. They were about testing human potential, fostering unity through competition, and honoring something greater than the self, whether that was the gods, the city-state, or the shared spirit of humanity. In that sense, every modern sporting event is, in some way, a continuation of the ancient Greek games. Cyniska entered the world around 440 BCE in the heart of Sparta's most powerful era. She was no ordinary Spartan girl. She was born into the royal Agiad line, one of the two dynasties that shared Sparta's kingship. Her father, King Archidamus II, was a respected military leader, and her mother came from a noble family that valued both tradition and discipline. Cyniska's birthright placed her at the intersection of political power, military prestige, and social expectation. In most of ancient Greece, such a position for a woman meant a life spent indoors, managing household affairs and leaving public life entirely to men. But Sparta was different. Here, women had a role that startled outsiders, freer, more physically active, and more independent than anywhere else in the Greek world. From a young age, Cyniska, like other Spartan girls, was expected to train her body. She ran, threw the discus, wrestled in light forms, and rode horses with the same determination as her brothers. Her education, too, was shaped by Sparta's unique culture. While male citizens were forged in the agoge, the harsh military training system, girls underwent their own regimen, focusing on strength, endurance, and discipline. Spartan society believed that strong women produced strong warriors, and a princess like Cyniska was expected to embody the ideal. Her upbringing would have been a blend of athleticism, household management, and awareness of her political standing. Her royal status also brought her into close proximity with the great figures of her time. Her brother, Agesilaus II, though not yet king during her youth, was already a prominent figure in Spartan politics. The two shared a close relationship, one that would later prove instrumental in shaping Cyniska's path to the Olympic Games. Life in Sparta was not luxurious in the way other Greek elites might enjoy. Even as royalty, Cyniska would have lived in relatively simple quarters, eaten the same plain meals of barley bread and black broth, and adhered to the same austere values as other Spartans. Yet the resources at her disposal, especially horses, trainers, and connections, would one day give her the means to enter a realm few women had ever touched, the world of Olympic chariot racing. In this environment, Cyniska's character was forged, disciplined, ambitious, and unafraid to step into arenas traditionally reserved for men. She was a princess of Sparta, but more importantly, she was being prepared, knowingly or not, to make history. To understand Cyniska's path to Olympic glory, one must first understand the extraordinary place women held in Spartan life. In most Greek city-states, women's roles were strictly domestic. In Athens, for example, women of status rarely left the home and had little public presence. Sparta was the exception, so much so that outsiders often viewed Spartan customs with a mix of shock and fascination. From an early age, Spartan girls were encouraged, indeed expected, to train their bodies. Physical strength wasn't seen as a masculine trait. It was a civic duty for women. The reasoning was blunt. Strong, healthy women would bear strong, healthy children, ensuring the city's military dominance. Girls practiced running, wrestling, discus throwing, and javelin, often competing in public festivals. Unlike the long, heavy garments worn elsewhere, Spartan women trained in short tunics that allowed freedom of movement, further shocking conservative Greek observers. This emphasis on physical fitness was matched by a notable degree of independence. While Spartan men spent most of their lives in military service, women oversaw the estates, managed finances, and made decisions about agriculture and property. In a society where wealth often came from land worked by helots, enslaved laborers, Spartan women could become significant landowners in their own right. By the 4th century BCE, they controlled a large portion of Spartan property, an unthinkable reality in most of Greece. Education for Spartan girls, while not as formal as the male agoge, still emphasized discipline, resilience, and public confidence. They were taught songs and dances for religious festivals, but also how to speak directly and assertively. Ancient writers often remarked, sometimes critically, that Spartan women were outspoken, unafraid to challenge men or voice political opinions. This cultural environment created a unique opportunity for someone like Cynisca. Her athletic training was not an anomaly, it was part of her expected upbringing. Her access to horses, stables, and skilled trainers, thanks to her royal status, meant she could excel in equestrian pursuits. In other Greek cities, a woman openly managing a racing team would have been unthinkable. In Sparta, it was unconventional, but not impossible. Spartan society had its rigid hierarchies and harsh realities, but for women, it offered a measure of public presence and physical freedom that was unparalleled in the ancient Greek world. It was this blend of athletic expectation, economic influence, and social boldness that gave Cynisca the platform from which she could attempt something no woman had done before: winning at the Olympic Games. In the ancient Greek world, chariot racing was one of the most prestigious and dangerous events in the Games. Unlike foot races or wrestling, which tested the athlete directly, chariot racing combined human skill with the speed and stamina of horses. It was a spectacle of power, wealth, and daring, and for centuries it was dominated by men of means. The races took place in the Hippodrome, a large elongated arena with 2 sharp turning posts, nisi, at either end. These turns were the most treacherous part of the race. Drivers had to steer their teams of 2 or 4 horses at high speed around these posts, without flipping the lightweight wooden chariot. Collisions were common, and a crash could take out multiple competitors at once. Owning and training a racing team was no small feat. It required stables, skilled grooms, trainers, and access to the finest horses. Because of this, chariot racing often became a contest between wealthy patrons rather than between the drivers themselves. The person officially recorded as the winner was not the charioteer, but the owner of the team. This rule would become the crucial loophole that allowed Cynisca to compete, without ever holding the reins in the race itself. Victories in chariot racing brought immense honor. Winning at Olympia or another pan-Hellenic festival could elevate a family's status, solidify political influence, and immortalize a name in victory odes composed by renowned poets. The prizes themselves, such as the olive wreath at Olympia, held symbolic rather than material value, but the prestige was worth far more than gold. Chariot racing was also a deeply symbolic sport. Horses were associated with nobility, strength, and martial readiness, and the event reflected the elite's ability to command both wealth and power. For many city-states, a victory was a matter of civic pride, not just personal achievement. For a woman, however, this world was nearly inaccessible. Women were forbidden from entering the Olympic Stadium as competitors, or even, in most cases, as spectators. But because the rules recognized the owner of the horses rather than the driver, there was no law that said that owner could not be a woman. This subtle technicality created a rare opening, one that Cynisca of Sparta would seize with historic consequences. Her decision to enter this elite, male-dominated sport would not only challenge the traditions of Olympia, but also set her on a path to become the first woman ever to win at the Olympic Games. Cynisca's journey to Olympic glory began with a combination of personal ambition, royal influence, and a keen understanding of the loopholes in the Olympic rules. As a princess of the Agiad line, she possessed the wealth necessary to own and maintain horses, one of the most significant barriers to entry in chariot racing. Yet wealth alone didn't explain her decision to enter. In a society where women were excluded from competing in the games, Cynisca's move was nothing short of audacious. Historians often point to the role of her brother, King Agesilaus II, in encouraging her Olympic ambitions. Agesilaus was a shrewd and sometimes provocative leader, and some sources suggest he urged Cynisca to compete partly to prove that winning Olympic chariot races was more a matter of money and horse breeding than personal athletic skill. Whether his motivations were political, familial pride, or a mix of both, his support gave Cynisca the political backing to proceed. With resources and royal connections at her disposal, Cynisca assembled a team of top-tier horses and skilled trainers. Her stables would have been among the finest in Greece, staffed by experienced grooms and handlers who understood every nuance of preparing a team for the grueling Olympic course. She oversaw breeding programs, selected the best animals, and ensured they were conditioned to handle the demands of high-speed turns and long, hard sprints. The decision to compete was also a statement of Spartan boldness. Sparta was already viewed by other Greeks as an unconventional society, especially in its treatment of women. For a Spartan princess to step into the Olympic sphere was provocative, but not entirely unthinkable given her city's unique culture. Cynisca's entry into the games was a calculated challenge to the norms of the wider Greek world. When the time came to enter her team, Cynisca did so as the official owner, the name that would be recorded in the Olympic registers should her chariot win. She would not hold the reins herself during the race. That role fell to her professional charioteer. But under Olympic law, the victory would belong entirely to her, cementing her place in history should her horses cross the finish line first. It was a daring gamble, both a test of her stable's excellence and a bold step into a domain no woman had claimed before. Cynisca was ready to stake her reputation on the speed of her horses and the precision of her team. The year was around 396 BCE, and the air at Olympia was thick with dust, anticipation, and the scent of sacrifice from the altars of Zeus. For Cynisca, this was the culmination of years of preparation. Though she would not stand in the chariot herself, the outcome of the four-horse race, the most prestigious event in the Games, would determine whether her name would be etched into history. The hippodrome stretched before the competitors, a long, treacherous course with two perilous turning posts at either end. Crashes here were common, and a single miscalculation could send a team into ruin. As the starting signal was given, the horses surged forward in a thunder of hooves and the creak of straining wheels. Cynisca's team, trained to perfection, kept a steady but aggressive pace, avoiding the chaos that claimed less disciplined competitors. Races were as much about strategy as speed. Cynisca's driver knew to conserve the horse's strength early on, biding his time for the final push. On the last lap, the team made its move, hugging the turning posts with daring precision. Competitors who had led early faltered, their horses tiring under the strain. Cynisca's team surged ahead, crossing the finish line first amid the roar of the crowd. When the victory was announced, it was her name, not the driver's, that was proclaimed. The rules of the Olympics made the owner of the team the official victor, and for the first time in recorded history, that victor was a woman. In a festival where women were forbidden even to watch the events, with rare exceptions, Cynisca had not only participated, she had won. The symbolism of her triumph was unmistakable. It was a direct challenge to the idea that women could not gain honor in the public sphere. Her win proved that, at least in chariot racing, wealth, strategy, and skill in horse management could overcome gender barriers. The aftermath was immediate. Her name spread across Greece, and poets and historians recorded her achievement. Statues were commissioned at Olympia itself, an unprecedented honor for a woman, depicting her and her chariot, ensuring that every visitor to the sanctuary would see the proof of her victory. For Cynisca, this was more than personal glory. It was a statement that the playing field, under the right circumstances, could be widened if one had the courage, resources, and determination to race upon it. Cynisca's first victory had already secured her a place in history, but she was not content to be remembered for a single triumph. 4 years later, at the next Olympic Games in 392 BCE, she entered the four-horse chariot race once again, bringing with her the same meticulous preparation, elite horses, and unshakable determination that had propelled her to glory the first time. Her repeat participation was itself a statement. Some might have dismissed her initial win as a stroke of fortune, a one-time challenge to tradition that would fade into novelty. Cynisca's return sent a different message. She was no curiosity. She was a competitor. By now, her stables had an even greater reputation. Breeders and trainers across Greece knew that her horses were among the best in the land, bred for endurance, speed, and obedience. Her team arrived at Olympia with the quiet confidence of champions, but the stakes were higher. Rivals had studied her previous victory, and many sought to dethrone the woman who had dared to invade their domain. The race unfolded with the same high drama that defined the event. Close calls at the turning posts, crashes that eliminated contenders, and the relentless pounding of hooves on packed earth. Cynisca's driver, experienced from the first win, once again employed disciplined pacing and strategic overtaking. On the final lap, her horses surged forward, overtaking the competition in a display of sheer power and coordination. When the dust settled, Cynisca had done the unthinkable. She had won the Olympic chariot race for the second consecutive time. This second victory silenced critics and cemented her status as one of the most remarkable figures in Greek sporting history. Her achievement was not an accident. It was the result of calculated investment, exceptional management, and a willingness to defy societal norms. In the aftermath, her fame spread even further. Her statues at Olympia, already a rarity for women, stood as enduring symbols of her triumphs. Inscribed on them were the words that proclaimed her the only woman to have won such honors in the Games, a boast no one could challenge. Visitors from across the Greek world would see her name and image, and her victories became part of the lore of Olympia itself. Through her second win, Cynisca transformed from a daring pioneer into a legend whose legacy would inspire debate, admiration, and imitation for centuries. Cynisca's twin victories at Olympia were celebrated far beyond the Hippodrome, but nowhere did they resonate more deeply than in her home city of Sparta. In a society already famed for its unconventional treatment of women, her achievements became a point of civic pride, reinforcing the idea that Sparta was unlike any other Greek city-state. For Spartan women, Cynisca's success was both inspirational and affirming. She had proven that women could claim public honor through sport, a realm overwhelmingly dominated by men. While no tidal wave of female Olympic competitors followed, Greek traditions were still too deeply entrenched. Cynisca's wins planted the idea that a woman's achievements could be immortalized alongside those of men. In a world where most women's names were lost to history, hers would be carved in stone. Her victories also reflected the Spartan ideal of arete, excellence in all endeavors, an ideal not confined to the battlefield. For male Spartans, her triumphs were a testament to the city's resources, discipline, and breeding expertise. For female Spartans, they were a demonstration of their own potential within the cultural freedoms their society allowed. Cynisca's status as a member of the royal family amplified her influence. Her victories were not just personal, they were political. They showcased Sparta's wealth, its mastery over elite horses, and its ability to dominate even in competitions that did not require spears and shields. For Agesilaus II, her brother and the reigning king, Cynisca's success was a tool to underscore Sparta's prestige in the Greek world. Her legacy took physical form in the statues erected at Olympia, bronze images of her chariot and horses, accompanied by inscriptions boldly declaring her the first woman to win at the Games. Such monuments were unprecedented, and they ensured her name would be spoken by pilgrims, athletes, and poets for generations. Back in Sparta, she returned not just as a sister of the king, but as a figure who had bent tradition without breaking it. She had competed within the rules, exploited their loopholes, and emerged victorious without directly confronting the deeply ingrained gender barriers of her time. In doing so, she achieved something rare, lasting fame without triggering the kind of backlash that might have erased her memory. In the quiet streets and training grounds of Sparta, young women would hear her story. They would know that one of their own had raced in the most prestigious arena of Greece, and won. Twice. Cynisca's victories at Olympia did not open the floodgates for women to participate widely in the Games. Ancient Greek society was still bound tightly by traditions that kept athletics largely male. But her success cracked the door, showing that female achievement in sport was possible, even within the rigid framework of the time. In most of Greece, women were still excluded from direct competition. The Olympic Games remained closed to them as athletes and, in most cases, even as spectators. However, Cynisca's wins set a precedent that could not be ignored. The rules recognized the owner of the horses, not the driver, and nowhere did those rules explicitly bar women. This subtle distinction meant that wealthy women in other city-states could, in theory, follow her example. A handful eventually did, especially in equestrian events at other Pan-Hellenic festivals, though none matched Cynisca's renown. Her achievement also fueled conversation across the Greek world. In Athens and other conservative cities, her story was sometimes framed as a curiosity, a Spartan eccentricity rather than a model to follow. But in more progressive or competitive circles, it was a reminder that honor was not inherently male. This shift in perception was small, but it marked an early challenge to the notion that sport was the exclusive domain of men. The symbolic value of her victory extended far beyond athletics. In literature, her name began appearing as an example of ambition and boldness. Her story was woven into discussions of women's capabilities in politics, property management, and public life. Philosophers and historians recorded her feat not just as a sporting fact, but as evidence of Sparta's unique approach to gender roles. Over time, Cynisca became part of the broader narrative of exceptional women in the ancient world, those rare figures who crossed into traditionally male arenas. While she did not inspire a full-fledged movement for women's athletics in antiquity, she became a touchstone for later generations, studying the intersection of gender, wealth, and power in Greece. In the centuries that followed, her name endured precisely because it was rare. The Olympic registry still bore the record of a woman who had triumphed twice in one of the most prestigious events of the Games. For ancient women, Cynisca's victories were a distant beacon, proof that under the right circumstances, determination and resources could bend the rules of tradition. Cynisca's exact date of death is unknown, but by the time her life drew to a close, likely in the early 4th century BCE, her name was already etched into the annals of Greek history. She had accomplished something no other woman had before her, not just entering the Olympic record books, but doing so twice in consecutive victories. For a society where women's names were rarely recorded outside of marriage contracts or funerary inscriptions, this was extraordinary. In Sparta, her death would have been marked with the quiet dignity befitting a royal. Yet her legacy was anything but silent. The statues she had commissioned at Olympia, featuring her chariot and horses, stood as a permanent reminder of her triumphs. These monuments were not modest. They carried inscriptions proudly declaring her as the first woman to win at the Olympic Games. Visitors to Olympia would see them and speak her name, ensuring that her story lived on with every retelling. Her historical significance extended beyond her own lifetime. In the centuries that followed, historians such as Pausanias recorded her achievements, marveling at how a woman had managed to secure victory in such a male-dominated sphere. They recognized that she had worked within the rules, not by breaking them, but by exploiting a rare opening, owning a team rather than driving it, and using that to claim victory. This distinction is crucial to understanding her impact. Cynisca's victories did not dismantle the gender boundaries of the Olympic Games, but they revealed their weaknesses. They proved that women could earn honor on the same public stage as men if they had the means, ambition, and courage to try. This lesson resonated not just in athletics, but in other areas of Greek life where tradition seemed immovable. In modern times, Cynisca has become an emblem for early female achievement in sport. Her story is cited in discussions of women's barriers in athletics, often as a reminder that those barriers have always been challenged, even in the most tradition-bound eras. She stands alongside other pioneering women in history whose accomplishments were rare but transformative. Cynisca of Sparta lived in a world where her victories were considered anomalies, yet she turned them into monuments of permanence. Through her horses, her victories, and her unyielding ambition, she claimed a slice of immortality, ensuring that, millennia later, we still remember the princess who outran the limits of her time.